Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Bird Bones Picked Clean, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by the avid reader _ sometimes writer, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Angela.
Bird Bones Picked Clean, Chapter 1, Enter Bellwether. Rael Collar was one of the most infuriating people Abigail Bellwether had ever met. She frustrated Abigail almost as much as Libba's wife did, but the history wasn't there. They were strangers. But even in the beginning, the High Atlantic witch had picked up that there was something off. Collar was brash, she was blunt, and had a clear resentment towards both Abigail herself and the army as a whole because of how her mother had been lost. The High Atlantic couldn't fault her for that. And it had come to a head in those first days when they'd ended up descending into a physical fight so charged that together they created a thunderstorm inside the training pit. Sergeant Quartermain hadn't stopped them until the lightning had crackled and arced against the metal rafters of the building. In hindsight, that decision had been for the best. Both girls had needed that confrontation to happen. It eventually led to a tentative alliance and a clear ceasefire within a newly dubbed Bellwether unit. Her unit mate was powerful. That much was obvious to the mostly self-appointed unit leader after that first fight. Collar still had an issue with authority that Abigail wasn't sure if it came before or after what happened to her mother, but things had started to settle down between them. The blonde had an attitude and a dry sense of humor, but she was smart. Collar was a damn good fighter and fixer when she focused that anger correctly, and a loyal friend and sister once she'd gotten comfortable with them. It had taken Abigail a while to finally pin it down, about as long as it had taken Rael to finally open up a bit to Tally and herself. But after finding her smallest sister washed up on that beach, so very lost and tormented, she'd recognized what it was. She'd had a hunch of it after the wedding, and this part of the breakdown had confirmed enough of it for Abigail to worry. Mental health was difficult. It could be insidious, and Rael was suicidal. It wasn't actively so. People didn't often realize that you can in fact be such a dark thing passively, but that's what it was. Even in the breakdowns, Rael didn't try to actively pursue death. She didn't seek it out or cause harm to herself to express the deafening pain she was in. But Abigail knew what to look for. She's seen it before. War isn't without its consequences, especially for those who wage it. It wasn't something they talked about in polite company. She's lost cousins that were still fighting battles even though they were safe again, and she knows other families have too. They don't mention it and they don't bring it up, but they all knew it for what it was. The demon that war left behind in some of them as its price. Rael carries a similar demon. Hers is hidden. It waits and watches. Her sister won't seek out death, but she doesn't avoid it either. She's reckless in a way that tells the High Atlantic witch that Rael doesn't care what happens to herself. She does very much care about what happens to her sisters and strives to make sure that they're safe, but she's quick enough to disregard her own safety. She'd caught hints of it in her sister's anger and rebellious streak. Her behavior came from something deeper, a deeply seated pain that made the blonde lash out, so she didn't have to feed it alone. So she didn't become so crushed by its weight. Abigail is sure it stemmed from the death of her mother, and know everything with Scylla had only made it worse. Love was messy. It only triggers Abigail's stubborn protective streak. Rael and Tally are a unit. They're her sisters. They're hers. Abigail's to look after and protect, and that's a duty she takes very seriously. It makes her a stubborn bitch, and she knows it. But for either of them, she'd burn down the world. External threats are much easier to defend against than internal ones. But she's determined, and she'll protect Rael from anything. Everything. Even herself, and that seems to be the biggest threat currently. Abigail had promised both herself and her sister that, after she and Tally had begged Bridie to either let them or help them go after their missing sister. "I have strict instructions to remain in Fort Salem," Bridie had told them initially, her face and rigid posture unyielding. "And I have strict instructions to defend and protect my unit at all costs," Abigail had growled. "You can file a report." A report? Nothing. This was her sister, and Bridie was a fool if she thought that telling Abigail and Tally no would stop them from going after Rael. Time to be a stubborn bitch then. She tried to be nice first and go by the book. Tally could attest to that. Tally's plea had started to soften the older witch, and it tells Abigail exactly the words that might just do it. "Bridie, listen. When I met Rael, I thought she was a shitbird who would take my unit down. But it hasn't turned out like that. Rael is my sister, and I know that you know what that means. You weren't able to save your sister, and I can't imagine what that feels like. Please, don't make me find out. Let me do what you wanted to do, Bridie. Let me save my girl and bring her home." It might have been a low blow, but it didn't make it any less true or sincere, and it had worked. Rael had looked so small and broken when they'd spotted her, and neither of them had run faster in their lives than they did when they'd ran to her side. Her sister had been so limp and still that Abigail and Tally had both feared the worst until they could touch her. The fixer's clothes were soaked with salt water, and her blonde hair was plastered to her head and face, but she was warm, and she was breathing still. They had made it in time. "Rael, wake up!" Finding her had been half the battle. Abigail didn't know why her sister was unconscious. It could be the fact that she should have drowned. How she didn't baffles the high Atlantic. It could just be exhaustion, being emotional or physical from their overload the excess salva had put her small form through. Rael had finally stirred after Tally had dragged the blonde over onto her back, and they'd pulled her further out of the water, keeping her leaning, halfway sitting up between them. "Please wake up," Abigail had pleaded just before it happened. The question and subsequent realization and its effect on her sister breaks the taller girl's heart. Rael was suffering and shattering before them. It only made her chest tighten when the blonde tried to deliriously prove that Scylla was alive, begging Abigail to see whatever she'd seen, to listen and understand, but there had been nothing there, and a gentle admittance of that only sent her sister spinning again. The next wave of her grief took the form of anger, and the high Atlantic could only watch and wait as the desperate yelling and raging ran its course. Rael was wobbly and unsteady the entire time, even though she'd managed to stand on her own. It had been short-lived before she tilted and collapsed back down again. Abigail was closest, and she'd shot forward to try and catch her sister, but the blonde had fallen too quickly, sinking to all fours in the water. Tally had been by her other side, and they kept the fixer between them again as she'd been racked with sobs. Their sister still lurched unsteadily, braced against Tally first, before finally sinking most of her weight into Abigail, who easily kept her there, kept her close. Abigail was steady, and Tally was soft, and they'd both been gentle and patient until the first storm had finally run out of rain. They got their sister to stand and kept her arms over their shoulders as they walked, united. It was slow, and Rael stumbled over rocks and bunches of seaweed, but they'd made it back up to where Bridie waited anxiously in the still-running truck. It would have been faster if Abigail had carried her sister. The blonde looked dead on her feet, but Rael was still surprisingly conscious, and she knew that her sister had pried to her. It's something the taller witch understands. The fixer had shown enough weakness that day, and if she just carried her like she'd wanted to, Rael might have felt smothered and shut them out again. That's not a risk the unit leader was willing to take. Bridie's relief had been silent, but clearly visible when they passed by the windows of the cab on their way back to the bed. Abigail had hopped up first, the strongest of her sisters, and with Tally's help had pulled the tired blonde up after her, with the redhead following behind. Rael had all but collapsed against her chest when she was up, her eyelids fluttering, and Abigail caught her easily. "Okay, I've got you. Just a little further and we're gonna sit. Then we can rest for a bit until we're back to base," the taller witch promised near her sister's ear, and got a sluggish nod in return. She'd pressed a kiss to the top of blonde hair and guided them to sit on the wooden bench that runs the inside of the bed with their backs to the cab. They kept Rael sandwiched between them, and she'd been asleep against Abigail's shoulder not long after the truck started back up the road and on its way back to base. It was then that she'd whispered her promise against the drying blonde hair, saying the words out loud, but only for herself and her resting sister to hear. When they'd gotten back to base, it had been just after dinner, and Sergeant Quartermain had been less than pleased. She was even more displeased when Abigail and Tally both had eaten all of the demerit she gave them, without even flinching from missing training the 3 days Rael spent in the infirmary recovering from her salva overdose. Both of them refused point blank to leave their sister's side until she left with them. Abigail is gentle with her sister after Rael is finally cleared, but not enough to make the blonde feel coddled. She doesn't act too much different than usual, except that she tries to listen better and be more patient. She doesn't let the fixer out of her sight if she can avoid it. Abigail hasn't missed the weird reactions she's had every time Scylla is mentioned, nor the flashes of guilt whenever the redhead tries to comfort their blonde sister. The High Atlantic witch isn't sure what's going on there, but she's more worried about Rael. Of the two of them, Tally seems the least likely to need her right now. The worst threat her redhead sister could face at the moment is the wrath of Garrett's wife, and Tally said she'd been able to handle herself there, so that was that. Tally is the one who shakes Abigail out of nightmares she sometimes gets about the way she found Charvel the day of the wedding. She'll sit with her and listen if she wants to talk, and doesn't say anything if Abigail can't do anything but cries silently with her head on her sister's shoulder. Abigail is the one who deals with Rael's much more frequent bad dreams. She chooses the descriptor bad dreams because they're not always nightmares, and they don't always wake the blonde up. She's almost always tuned into the fixer now, especially at night. She's not entirely sure why that is, or how it came to be, but it helps her protect her sister, so she doesn't let those questions bother her in the least. Even the smallest noise from Rael will wake Abigail and pull her out of her bunk and across the room to sit with her sister. Some of the time, her presence alone is enough to settle the smaller girl. Another odd thing she can't explain yet doesn't seek answers for due to its usefulness, but other times it takes Abigail rubbing her back or playing with her hair and murmuring soft nothings to get her to quiet and steal back into a calmer sleep. On the not-so-rare occasion that it is a nightmare, Abigail is genuinely already in the process of trying to calm her when Rael snaps awake in tears or frantic and disoriented. She stays calm and steady and waits to see what her sister needs. Some of the time, she'll wrap the blonde up in her arms and let her cry herself out, but some of the time, it takes Rael a minute to come back to herself and recognize Abigail and her surroundings. And the taller witch knows better than to try to touch her until she's fully aware again. From there, it can go one of three ways. The first is her sister crying herself out in her arms. It just might be delayed by how she's woken up. The second option is the pair of them sitting in silence until the fixer falls back to sleep. Some of the time, she'll seek comfort from the taller witch while they sit. asking wordlessly for her hand to hold by extending her own out and waiting, or laying back down with her head across Abigail's thighs and extending the unspoken invitation for one of Abigail's hands to start caressing gently through the blonde's locks. Raelle can't seem to find the words, or maybe she just doesn't trust her voice for whatever reason on those occasions. But she doesn't seem to need them, and in those moments, Abigail finds that she doesn't either. It creates the illusion that it's just the two of them, neither holding any expectations for the other, except their continued company and mutual agreement on their complete abandonment of the weight and unnecessary complexity that words and speech feels like it imposes. No need to decipher the puzzles of volume, tone, or inflection, and how they're meant. The conversations hidden between the spoken words, a puzzle within a puzzle, a delicate and carefully played game of truth and lies, a verbal game of chess, or a duel where the weapon of choice is wit over guns, scourges or fists. Words no longer hold meaning. The combinations of letters no longer a burden upon either. Those noises and all of their little eccentricities have no place between them anymore. It's a delicate thing when they find themselves in this version of the world. It's fragile, like a sheet of tissue paper, but at the same time it's freeing and as solid and real as either of them are to the other. They can just be, just Abigail and Raelle. Not soldiers, not witches, not last names, nor social classes. Where they came from doesn't matter, and where they'll end up doesn't exist yet. They're just two girls able to exist however they feel like right then, able to just breathe. Those moments are their own, and time doesn't feel like it applies to them at all. There's a strange sort of comfort and peace to be found in those silent hours, where nothing is real and anything is possible. Those moments are simple, no two the same, and it always makes Abigail feel like everything might be right in her world for a while. How odd that feeling is. That's the one that finally makes her start to wonder. Other times, the blonde lays with her back to her sister and pulls her blankets up over her shoulders, and the High Atlantic will retreat back to her own bunk to give her the space she's wordlessly asking for. She's not upset that those times Raelle has decided that she wants to be silent, to enter that nothing space, that void within which they sometimes share a simultaneous existence and non-existence, alone. Sometimes even silence can be deafening, and she understands that there are times when only a presence can feel too loud, even if no words are exchanged. It happens when Raelle probably feels too small and too vulnerable after whatever she's lived through in the nightmare, even when it's just Abigail with her. Things are just too much and too loud. Abigail will always give her the space and the solitude she seems to need to recover. The third option is much less common in occurrence than the first two. It's when Raelle decides to talk about it. Her voice almost always soft and haunted, and she won't make eye contact while she speaks. The blonde usually doesn't want or even expect Abigail to say much, really just needing the space and safety to get it out in words, something the taller girl has no problem giving her. She's more than content to listen.
Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own, and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.